Matthew Thompson worked diligently at his security job, his work boots squeaking against the polished floors. He was always the invisible, silent presence at these ultra-wealthy parties, among the champagne glasses and designer suits. Then she appeared, 16 years old, grief-stricken, staring at him across the crowded charity gala, like she'd seen a ghost. The champagne trembled in her hand. "Daddy!" The word hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd never seen this girl before in his life, but her eyes, even he could see how much they resembled his own. One blue, one black. How was that possible? The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across the ballroom of the Rothschild Foundation's annual charity gala. Matthew Thompson adjusted his ill-fitting security uniform and checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. 8:30 p.m. 2 more hours until his shift ended. 2 more hours until he could return to his cramped apartment, where his 8-year-old daughter Harper waited with Mrs. Chen from next door. The babysitting money would eat into his already thin paycheck, but working these high-end events was the only way to make extra cash for Harper's medical expenses. He positioned himself near the grand entrance, watching as America's elite filtered through the doors in designer gowns and $1,000 suits. Matt had learned to become invisible at these functions, a necessary skill for someone whose job was to blend into the background while keeping watch for trouble. His supervisor had made it clear on his first day, "You're here to observe, not participate." These people don't want to be reminded that the help is watching. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he stood, guarding people who spent more on a single bottle of wine than he made in a month, while his own daughter struggled with a rare autoimmune condition that required medications their insurance barely covered. But Matt had learned long ago that life wasn't fair, especially not for someone like him, a high school dropout who'd enlisted in the army at 18, served 2 tours overseas, and returned home to find that military experience and a strong back only got you so far in civilian life. Tonight's event was different from the usual corporate fundraisers he worked. The Rothschild Foundation was hosting a memorial gala in honor of Jonathan Rothschild, the billionaire philanthropist who had died in a plane crash 2 years ago. The man had been something of a legend in charitable circles, using his tech fortune to fund educational programs for underprivileged children. His death had sent shockwaves through both the business world and the non-profit sector. What made it even more tragic was that he'd left behind a teenage daughter, Isabel, who had reportedly become something of a recluse since losing her father. The evening progressed without incident until nearly 9 o'clock. Matt was positioned near the main bar when he noticed a young woman standing alone at the memorial display dedicated to Jonathan Rothschild. She looked to be about 16, with long, dark hair pulled back in an elegant updo that seemed too sophisticated for her age. Her black evening gown was clearly expensive, but she wore it like armor rather than decoration. There was something about her posture rigid, defensive, that reminded Matt of soldiers he'd known who were trying to hold themselves together in impossible circumstances. As he watched, she reached up to touch the photograph, her hand trembling slightly. Matt's training kicked in. He'd seen enough grief in his time, both overseas and at home after his wife Sarah's death from cancer 3 years ago. This girl was drowning in it, standing in a room full of people who probably offered their condolences and then moved on to discuss stock prices and vacation homes. He started moving toward her, not sure what he planned to do, but knowing he couldn't just stand there and watch someone break apart. He was halfway across the room when she turned around. The moment their eyes met, everything else fell away. The conversations, the clinking glasses, the soft jazz playing in the background. It all faded to nothing. Her eyes were identical to his own. One blue, one dark brown, a genetic quirk called heterochromia that he'd inherited from parents he'd never known. Matt had been told his whole life that the condition was extremely rare, passed down through specific bloodlines. The odds of meeting another person with the exact same variation were astronomical. But there she stood, this grief-stricken teenager at a memorial for one of the richest men in America, looking at him like she'd seen a ghost. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. "Daddy." The word escaped her lips in a whisper that somehow carried across the space between them. It wasn't a question so much as a prayer, as if she were calling out to someone she'd lost and desperately hoped to find again. Matt's world tilted on its axis. He'd never seen this girl before in his life, had no idea who she was or why she would call him by that name. But those eyes, those impossible, familiar eyes, were looking at him with a mixture of hope and desperate need that made his chest tighten. Around them, the other guests had begun to take notice. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to see what had caused the commotion. Matt could feel their stares like physical weight, their whispered questions creating a buzz of speculation. The girl took a step toward him, her face pale but determined. "I know this is impossible," she said, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying clearly in the hushed room. "I know you can't be him. But you look exactly like—" She gestured toward the memorial photograph behind her, and Matt's blood turned to ice. For the first time, he really looked at the picture of Jonathan Rothschild. The face staring back at him from the memorial display was like looking into a mirror. Same bone structure, same nose, same mouth. The only difference was the eyes in the photograph. Jonathan Rothschild had normal brown eyes, while Matt's unusual heterochromia had always made him stand out. But everything else, it was like seeing himself in an expensive suit, confident and successful in ways Matt had never been. "Miss Rothschild, please." An older woman in an elegant navy dress appeared at the girl's side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "You're causing a scene. Your father's memorial is not the place for this kind of confusion." So this was Isabel Rothschild, the billionaire's daughter. That explained the expensive dress and the way people were treating her with a mixture of deference and pity. But it didn't explain why she was looking at him like he held the answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask. Matt found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Miss, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I've never met you before, and I'm just security here tonight." He gestured to his uniform, acutely aware of how out of place he looked among these people. "I'm nobody special." But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. The resemblance to the photograph was undeniable. And those eyes. When was the last time he'd met someone else with heterochromia? Never, actually. Isabel shook her head, tears starting to flow freely down her cheeks. "No, you don't understand. My father had a twin brother. They were separated at birth, given up for adoption. I've been searching for him since Daddy died, trying to find some connection to family, to someone who might understand what it was like to be him." The words hit Matt like a physical blow. Adoption. Twins separated at birth. It was like she was describing the missing pieces of his own life, the questions about his origins that had haunted him since childhood. He'd grown up in foster care, never knowing anything about his biological parents, except that they'd been young and unable to care for him. The eyes. Isabel continued, her voice gaining strength. "Daddy always said his brother would have the same eyes he did, but different. One blue, one brown, just like yours. He said it was a family trait that skipped generations, but twins sometimes split the inheritance. Matt's head was spinning. This was insane. He was a construction worker and part-time security guard who lived paycheck to paycheck in a run-down apartment. The idea that he could be related to one of the richest men in America was beyond ridiculous. Yet the evidence was standing right in front of him, looking at him with eyes that mirrored his own in impossible ways. The crowd around them had grown larger, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of excitement that made Matt's skin crawl. But Isabel was still looking at him with that mixture of hope and desperation that reminded him too much of Harper when she was scared about her medical tests. "Miss Rothschild," the older woman said again, her voice carrying a note of warning. "This is neither the time nor the place. Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately." But Isabel ignored her, taking another step toward Matt. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I know this sounds crazy, but I've been alone for 2 years. Everyone keeps telling me to move on, to accept that Daddy's gone and focus on the future. But I can't let go of the possibility that somewhere out there, I have family." The raw pain in her voice cut through Matt's confusion and doubt. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself, the desperate need to belong somewhere, to find people who understood you without explanation. When Sarah had died, he'd experienced that same crushing loneliness. He looked around the room at the faces watching them, at the memorial photograph that seemed to mock him with its familiar features, at this girl who was looking at him like he might be her salvation. None of this made sense. He had a life, responsibilities, a daughter who needed him. But those eyes, they were looking at him with the same desperate hope he'd seen in Harper's face when the doctors had first explained her condition. Matt took a deep breath. "I think," he said slowly, "maybe we should talk." The older woman, whom Matt now realized must be some kind of family attorney, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "If you're serious about this, young man, then we'll need to do this properly. DNA tests, background checks, legal verification. The Rothschild estate is worth several $billion, and there have been numerous fraudulent claims since Jonathan's death." Matt felt his face flush with anger. "Lady, I don't know what kind of scam artists you usually deal with, but I'm not here for money. I didn't even know who this girl was until 5 minutes ago." He gestured to his security uniform again. "I'm working 3 jobs just to keep my daughter's medical bills paid. The last thing I need is some lawyer thinking I'm running a con game." Isabel seemed to see past his anger to the truth underneath. "You have a daughter?" she asked, her voice softer now. "How old is she?" 8, Matt replied automatically. "Her name is Harper. She has some health issues. Health. That's why I work these extra jobs, to help pay for her treatments." "Daddy always wanted more children," she said quietly. "After my mother died when I was little, he used to talk about how lonely it was being an only child. He said family was the only thing that really mattered. The similarity to his own situation wasn't lost on Matt. But this was happening too fast, spinning out of control in ways he couldn't process. An hour ago, he'd been a security guard. Now he was supposedly the long-lost twin brother of a billionaire. "I need some air," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He started moving toward the nearest exit, pushing through the crowd of curious guests. But Isabel followed him, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Please don't leave," she called after him. "I know this is overwhelming, but I've been searching for you for 2 years." Matt paused at the doors leading to the hotel's garden terrace. The cool night air felt like relief against his flushed face. "You don't understand," he said, turning to face her. I can't be who you think I am. I'm nobody special. I dropped out of high school, served in the army because I had no other options, and came home to work construction. Your father was a billionaire philanthropist who changed the world. We're not the same person. But that's exactly the point, Isabel said, her voice intense with conviction. Daddy always wondered what would have happened if he'd grown up differently, in a different family, with different opportunities. Maybe you're who he would have been if money and privilege hadn't defined his path. The idea was seductive in ways Matt didn't want to admit. He'd spent his entire life feeling like he was on the outside looking in. The possibility that his struggles weren't evidence of personal failure, but simply the result of different starting conditions, was both comforting and painful. Look, he said, trying to find solid ground. Even if we are related, even if your father was my biological brother, that doesn't change anything about my life. I still have responsibilities, a daughter who needs me, bills that won't pay themselves. Isabel's face fell, but she nodded with a maturity that seemed far beyond her 16 years. I understand. I'm not asking you to become someone else. I just want to know I'm not alone in the world. The loneliness in her voice was something Matt recognized intimately. Maybe that was what Isabel was really asking for. Not a replacement father or a solution to her grief, but simply the knowledge that she wasn't the only one carrying the weight of loss and responsibility. Okay, he said finally. Let's say we do the DNA test and find out if we're actually related. Then what? Isabel considered the question carefully. I don't know exactly. I guess I just want to know who my family really is, beyond the lawyers and trustees. I want to understand where I came from. That resonated with Matt more than he wanted to admit. He'd spent his entire life wondering about his origins, creating elaborate fantasies about parents who might have loved him if circumstances had been different. The attorney had followed them onto the terrace. If we're going to pursue this matter, I suggest we do so through proper legal channels, background investigations, genetic testing, interviews with character witnesses. Matt looked at her with new wariness. What kind of protocols? The estate has a responsibility to verify any claims before acknowledging family relationships. There are significant legal and financial implications to consider. The mention of money made Matt's stomach turn. I don't want anything from the estate, he said firmly. If we're related, that's between Isabel and me. It has nothing to do with money. But even as he said it, Matt couldn't ignore the practical implications. Harper's medical bills were crushing him. The idea that there might be resources available to help her get the treatment she needed was impossible to ignore, no matter how uncomfortable it made him feel. Isabel seemed to understand his internal conflict. The money isn't what matters, she said quietly. If you really are my uncle, then Harper is family too. And family takes care of each other. 3 weeks later, Matt sat in the sterile waiting room of a downtown medical facility, Harper fidgeting beside him while they waited for the results that would either confirm or destroy the most surreal chapter of their lives. The DNA test itself had been simple enough, just a cheek swab and some paperwork, but the implications hung over everything like a storm cloud. Isabel had insisted on being there for the results, arriving with Victoria Sterling, the lead attorney managing the Rothschild estate. Over the past 3 weeks, Matt had learned that Isabel was remarkably like Harper in some ways, curious, resilient, and far more mature than her years should have required. The two girls had bonded quickly during their first meeting, Harper's natural friendliness overcoming her usual shyness around strangers. Mr. Thompson? A technician appeared in the doorway, holding a manila folder that contained answers to questions Matt had been carrying his entire life. We're ready for you now. They filed into a small conference room where Dr. Patricia Wells, the genetic counselor, waited with charts and printouts spread across the table. Thank you all for coming, she began, settling into her chair. I'll get straight to the point, since I know you've been waiting anxiously for these results. She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. The DNA analysis confirms with 99.9% certainty that Matthew Thompson and Jonathan Rothschild were identical twins. The room fell silent. Matt had thought he was prepared for this possibility, but hearing it stated as scientific fact still hit him like a physical blow. Harper's small hand found his, squeezing tight as she sensed the magnitude of the moment. Furthermore, Dr. Wells continued, the analysis confirms that Isabel Rothschild is Matthew's biological niece, and Harper Thompson is Isabel's biological cousin? She smiled at the two girls. Your family, ladies. The genetic markers don't lie. Isabel started crying, but this time the tears were clearly tears of relief and joy. I knew it, she whispered. I knew the moment I saw you. Matt was struggling to process the enormity of what he'd just learned. Identical twins. That meant he and Jonathan Rothschild had started as the same person, literally sharing the same DNA. The differences between them, wealth versus poverty, success versus struggle, were entirely the result of circumstances beyond their control. Victoria Sterling cleared her throat diplomatically. There are, of course, legal matters to discuss. Jonathan's will made provisions for any family members who might be discovered after his death. As his identical twin, Matthew, you have certain inheritance rights. The mention of inheritance made Matt uncomfortable all over again. I told you before, I don't want... You don't want charity? Isabel interrupted, understanding his objection. I get that, but this isn't charity. This is family sharing resources so everyone can have what they need. Harper needs medical care, and we have the means to provide it. She leaned forward, her voice intense with conviction. Daddy always said that money was just a tool for taking care of the people you love. If you really are my uncle, if we're really family, then letting pride get in the way of Harper's health isn't noble, it's just stubborn. The truth of her words was undeniable, but it still felt wrong to Matt in ways he couldn't fully articulate. But when he looked at Harper, at her thin frame, and the circles under her eyes that came from fighting an illness her body wasn't equipped to handle, his personal pride seemed less important than her well-being. There's also the matter of Jonathan's personal effects, Victoria said, pulling out another folder. He kept extensive journals, photo albums, documents related to his search for his twin brother. Isabel thought you might want to see them, to understand who he was. Over the following months, as lawyers handled the complex legal work of integrating Matt into the Rothschild family legacy, he began to understand who Jonathan had been beyond the newspaper headlines. Through his journals and personal effects, Matt discovered a man who had been driven by the same sense of responsibility and family loyalty that had motivated his own choices, but who had channeled those impulses through philanthropy rather than personal sacrifice. Jonathan had been haunted by the same questions about identity and belonging that had plagued Matt throughout his life. Reading his brother's words was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just physical features, but emotional and psychological traits as well. Jonathan had written about feeling like an outsider despite his wealth and success, about struggling with the constant worry that he didn't deserve his good fortune. The answer, Matt realized, was yes. They had been more alike than either of them could have imagined, separated by circumstances, but united by the deeper currents of personality and character that flowed from their shared genetics. Harper's health improved dramatically once she had access to the best medical care money could buy. But perhaps more importantly, she gained something she'd never had before, a sense of extended family that went beyond just her and Matt. Isabel had moved back from her boarding school in Switzerland, choosing to finish her education in the United States so she could be closer to her newly discovered relatives. She and Harper quickly developed the kind of sisterly relationship that Matt had always wished he could provide for his daughter. The financial implications of his inheritance were staggering in ways that Matt was still learning to navigate. Beyond the immediate relief of Harper's medical expenses being covered, there were trusts and business interests that would require him to learn an entirely new vocabulary of wealth management. But more challenging than the money was figuring out how to integrate his old life with his new circumstances. Isabel helped with that transition more than anyone else. She understood the discomfort of not quite fitting into the world of extreme wealth, but she also helped Matt see that being true to himself didn't mean rejecting the resources that could help him take better care of the people he loved. Daddy used to say that authenticity wasn't about where you came from or how much money you had. She told him one evening as they watched Harper play in the garden of the family estate. It was about staying connected to what mattered most to you, no matter how much your external circumstances changed. 6 months after the DNA results, Matt found himself standing in the same ballroom where he'd first met Isabel, but this time as a guest rather than security. The Rothschild Foundation's annual gala had been transformed under his and Isabel's joint leadership, shifting focus to hands-on programs that addressed the practical needs of working families. Harper ran up to him, her face glowing with health and excitement. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than he used to make in a month, but she was still his daughter, curious, kind, and completely unimpressed by wealth for its own sake. Matt looked around the room at the faces of the people they were helping. Single parents struggling with medical bills, families dealing with job loss and housing instability, children who needed educational opportunities. These were his people, the community he'd always been part of, and now he had the resources to actually make a difference in their lives. Isabel appeared at his side, no longer the grief-stricken girl he'd met a year ago, but a confident young woman who had found her purpose in continuing her father's legacy. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him, "about how circumstances shape us, but don't define us. I think Daddy would have loved knowing that his brother turned out to be someone who understood what really mattered." Matt nodded, watching as Harper helped serve dinner to families who reminded him of where he'd come from. "I think you're right. I think he would have been proud to know that the money he made is being used to help people like we used to be." As the evening progressed, Matt found himself reflecting on the strange turns life could take, the way a single moment could change everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. A year ago, he'd been a struggling single father working security at events like this one, invisible to the wealthy guests. Now he was one of those guests. But with a difference, he remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to worry about every dollar. That perspective had become the driving force behind the changes he and Isabel had made. Instead of writing checks to established charities, they had started getting their hands dirty. They visited the families they were helping, listened to their stories, understood their specific needs. Harper had adapted to their new circumstances with remarkable resilience. Her health had improved dramatically, but more than that, she had blossomed into a confident, compassionate child who seemed to understand instinctively that their good fortune came with responsibilities. "She reminds me of Daddy when he was young," Isabel had observed one day. He always said that the best way to honor good luck was to share it with people who needed it more. That philosophy had become central to how Matt approached his new life. The money and resources weren't really his. They were tools that had been temporarily placed in his care, meant to be used for the benefit of people who were facing the same struggles he had known so intimately. As they prepared to leave the ballroom that evening, Matt thought about the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a struggling single father with no extended family, no safety net, no sense of belonging to anything larger than just him and Harper against the world. Now they were part of something bigger, not just the Rothschild legacy, but a chosen family built on love and mutual support. Harper took his hand as they walked to their car, her other hand holding tight to Isabel's. "Dad," she said, using the serious tone she reserved for her most important observations, "I think Uncle Jonathan would be happy that we found each other." Matt looked at his daughter, then at Isabel, who had become not just his niece, but truly his family in every sense that mattered. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I think he would be very happy indeed." They drove home through the quiet streets, three people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from the raw materials of loss and hope and the endless human capacity to create family from love rather than just blood. It wasn't the life any of them had planned, but it was the life they had chosen together, and that made all the difference.